Hey folks, I hope you're all doing well, and for my fellow Canadians, I hope you're all excited for a safe and socially responsible Thanksgiving weekend. I'm going to be cooped up at home this weekend. We've been isolating for a week tomorrow because someone in our household is sick and we've been waiting on a COVID test result. And I've been keeping myself from going crazy by sewing face masks. All by hand because I don't have a sewing machine. And I don't know, maybe I have gone crazy. But at least everyone I know will have an abundance of masks. In this video, we're going to be talking about the more practical aspects of authentic education, particularly what teaching and assessment looks like in this moment. I'm also going to be talking about a couple of questions that were submitted by people in our class. So let's start off by talking about why we're calling this moment authentic education. And I think Davis does a nice job of summarizing this pretty concisely. He states that authentic education is characterized by authentic or real problems. It's structured through authentic or genuine inquiry. It affords learners authentic or transformative feedback. And it nurtures our learners' authentic or unique being. And in authentic education, we're really honoring our learners' individual history as well as nurturing their potential. So what does this actually mean for learners and learning? Well, we talked a lot about knowing and learning in our last video, but in short, learning here is about coherence with the external world rather than correspondence to an objective truth. And here, knowing is always a subjective construal. It's an ongoing process of construing a world by constantly revising webs of associations in order to maintain a personally coherent sense of reality. And this helps us understand why people can interpret a similar experience differently. This web of associations is woven from their different experiences, which has an impact on their perspectives. And this is something we really want to keep in mind with our learners. And within authentic education, our learners are not seen as being incomplete, deficient humans or empty containers that we need to pour all of this knowledge into. Rather, they're very much active agents in the creation and the maintenance of their worlds. And the sense they make of our teaching really has more to do with their histories than what we may say or do as educators. But what does this actually mean for us as educators with regards to our teaching practice? Well, I think the biggest thing here is really that this is a shift in our mindset about how learning occurs. So we're looking at learning in terms of coherence rather than correspondence, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, is very much going to impact how we teach and assess our learners. And it's important to note in this mindset that we don't understand teaching as causing learning, and we can't compel our learners to learn certain things in a certain way. While learning is very much dependent on our teaching, it isn't determined by our teaching. Rather, we're influencing our learners' understandings as they're engaging in this ongoing process of maintaining this conceptual coherence by connecting experiences and updating these connections. So here we would describe teaching as facilitating, guiding, or enabling our learners. And a major issue that arises here is that theories arising from the authentic education movement are about learning, not teaching. So for example, constructivism is very much about personal sense-making. And as Davis points out, this at best tells us what not to do as educators than what we should actually do. And this brings us to a couple of questions that were raised by our class. First, how would a curriculum differ between standardized education and authentic education when executed in a classroom? Well, the curriculum wouldn't really change much, if at all, since authentic education doesn't really comment on this or challenge what our students should be learning. Instead, it critiques how we go about teaching by prompting us to consider how complex, diverse, and personal learning is for individuals. It also isn't outwardly against some of the prominent strategies we see used in standardized education, like lecturing or tests. Rather, it's about questioning the assumption that we can deliver education in this standardized way and expect the same end products in our learners, because learners will construe their experience in their own ways. But we can make changes in how we approach teaching this curriculum in our classroom, which is a really nice segue into our next question. What is a good method of balancing some level of course content standardization with creative approaches to teaching a particular topic? And I would say that the answer to this really varies based on the educational moment and the teaching philosophy of the educator, but for now we're going to address this from an authentic education standpoint. And a lot of standardization is already present in our teaching. As I've mentioned previously, we often have standardized textbooks, lesson plans, standardized tests, even the way our classrooms are set up. And some of this we unfortunately just have to work with as educators since that's the prevailing model. And I'm not saying that to be pessimistic, uninspiring, or to deter you from advocating for changes. It's just the reality of the system we work in. For example, I can't decide I don't want to assign grades because it's against my teaching philosophy. I work in a system that requires me to do so, and frankly, Uada probably wouldn't hire me again if I tried to pull that. But as this individual has pointed out, we can integrate a lot of creative approaches because there are areas we have a lot of flexibility in, such as our specific teaching strategies, how we go about them, and our assignments. And within this, we still may want to use some elements of standardized education. For example, I love rubrics. But a key perspective in authentic education is that we're focusing on individual development and growth. And there are a few practices we can consider as an educator within authentic education. Fixed and growth mindsets, for example, is something that could be useful to consider within our learners, and the characteristics of which I've included here. And as Davis points out, the fixed mindset learners may be more likely to engage in surface-level learning and often stall in their development. And they may shut down in the face of a challenge or failure and avoid feedback or correction. Meanwhile, a growth mindset learner may engage in deeper learning and continue to improve in their growth. And here, failures and challenges are seen as teachable moments, and these students seek to learn from the feedback they receive. And our own mindset here as educators is really important, since this is going to be manifested through our teaching. And this can contribute to a fixed or growth mindset in our learners. And here you can see some examples of how we may contribute to a fixed mindset. For example, praising their abilities, which makes it seem like they have very fixed traits. And as educators, we can contribute instead to a growth mindset. For example, praising our learners for their effort rather than their ability, to show that we're interested in their growth and their development as a person. Differentiated learning is another concept we can consider in our teaching practice. So as we discussed in Module 2, we want to consider those meaningful differences between our learners and take those into consideration in our teaching. As Dr. Trumpower says, we want to refocus on differences that matter. And there are also some specific teaching strategies that fit within this educational moment. Problem-based learning and reflective practice are good examples, both of which are very popular in health professions education. Problem-based learning, or PBL as you'll often hear it called, originated at McMaster University here in Ontario in the mid-1960s in response to medical students becoming disenchanted with their education and overloaded with scientific information that seemed completely irrelevant to their clinical practice. So PBL is a learner-centric teaching strategy focusing on real-world problems. In groups of typically around 8, learners work through a real-world problem. In the case of medical education, this would be a clinical scenario, to develop a viable solution. And here students have to build on their prior knowledge and connect it to new experiences. During this process, a facilitator is present to help guide the discussion. And reflective practice is another good example, and my fellow health and social care professionals will be very familiar with this one, although it is common practice in other areas. And this is a critical, deliberate inquiry into our professional practice, and it can be done individually or as a group. And reflective practice actually begins with John Dewey, who talked about how we learn through action, or by doing things, and then realizing the outcome of this action. And Dewey defined reflection as an active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief and supposed form of knowledge in light of the ground that supports it, and further conclusions to which it tends. So we can see how this fits nicely within a coherence understanding of knowing and learning. And Dewey's ideas were expanded into the professional world in the 1980s, and the term reflective practice came into use. Now, assessment is another area where we can often implement some of these more creative or authentic approaches to our teaching. And within this moment, since we don't see our learners as being deficient or incomplete, assessment isn't about identifying shortcomings or ranking our learners. And keep in mind also that in constructivism, we acknowledge that our learners' beliefs and understandings are derived from their histories. So they may resist to making a change when we tell them their answer is wrong, if it's still personally viable within their web of associations or their schema. So in this case, they're not accommodating this into their schema. Now, Engaging Minds talks a little bit about authentic assessment. And here the authors are talking about this in a way of distinguishing standardized evaluations from tasks that are designed to support learner agency, engagement, and metacognition. And a vital feature of authentic assessment is that it be aimed towards upcoming learning experiences and not summing up past ones. And a lot of time in the literature, this also refers to assessment strategies that are more similar to the real-world situations and are relevant to the learner. And I want to expand on this idea a bit more since you'll see this a fair bit in the literature. So a lot of the assessments we do in schools, like tests, can actually be pretty removed from the reality we need to be able to function in. So authentic assessment, from this perspective, is trying to reduce this distance from the real world. And the goal here is to make students think, learn, and perform in a manner similar to the real world. And approaching authentic education in this manner seems a little more obvious in some contexts. For example, in the performing arts, we evaluate dance by having our learners actually dance. And this also makes a lot of sense in vocational and professional programs. For example, we can't just assess surgical residents with computer simulation and multiple choice tests. Authentic assessment, like actually doing a surgery, needs to be part of this. But we also don't want to solely use authentic education. Like, can you imagine if training a surgeon was only done this way? We really don't want them doing bypass surgery on their first day, since this could have some extremely negative consequences for the patient and for the learner. So we need some balance here. Another approach to assessment is formative assessment, which is assessments that are conducted during the learning process. And this is also sometimes called assessment for learning. It's more informal and ongoing, and it's more focused on the learner's improvement and growth. Typically, this isn't associated with grades, but if it is, it's much lower stakes. And assessments that are conducted at the end of the learning process, whether it be the end of a course or an educational unit, is called summative assessment or assessment of learning. And this is for grades, and it tends to be higher stakes marks like final exams. And we tend to see this a little bit more in standardized education, but it is not exclusively used in standardized education. And I want to make it clear that I'm not saying that formative is good and summative is bad. They're really just assessment practices that are done at different times, and they're used differently. I also want to share a quick example of a specific assessment strategy that's popular within authentic education: portfolios. And these can be paper-based or digital e-portfolios. And there's a lot of different definitions for portfolios, but they're generally understood to be a curation of work that demonstrates the learner's abilities, as well as capturing the individual's learning over time. And these are pretty popular in both K-12 classrooms and in higher education. And there are quite a few courses in this program, like our course, that use portfolios. And there are different types of portfolios, such as assessment portfolios, presentation portfolios, learning portfolios, professional development portfolios, and working portfolios. And they can serve different purposes as well. For example, they could be a repository of the learner's work, a stimulus for reflection, which is more what we're using them for in this course, as well as a way to showcase your work. So often with portfolios, learners get to select what actually goes into their portfolio, much like a curator at an art gallery when they're selecting pieces for a collection. And from a more of an epistemological stance, we can approach portfolios in a couple of different ways. In a more standardized education vein of thought, we can approach portfolios as just being a documentation that a learner is meeting standards. And from an authentic education standpoint, specifically constructivism, we could approach this as being more of a story of the individual's learning. So I'm curious, prior to this class, have you experienced portfolios or e-portfolios in your learning? If so, would you describe the epistemological approach to these portfolios as being more aligned with standardized education or authentic education? Or perhaps something else? So let's revisit those questions from our previous chat. What is the purpose of schooling? Is it about technical proficiency or conceptual understanding? And I think the answer to this would really depend on who you talk to, even amongst those who firmly align themselves with this moment. But I think we can make an argument here for both. I don't think an educator more aligned with authentic education would say that technical proficiency is unimportant, especially in vocational or professional education. Can you imagine if technical proficiency wasn't important in areas like medicine, nursing, dance, auto mechanics? But conceptual understanding here is also very important. Like Dewey said, we should have integration of our vocational and liberal education because both are important. So then what should school be? And once again, this probably depends on the specific teaching philosophy of the educator. But a really strong theme in this moment is an emphasis on nurturing human growth and development rather than imposing standards of performance. But unfortunately, authentic education doesn't really critique the curriculum, including what is or isn't present in it. Namely, what ideas are we perpetuating through this curriculum, and whose voices are absent? And these are ideas we're going to delve into in democratic citizenship education. And that's all for now, folks. I hope this video helped you see some of the more practical applications of authentic education, albeit this one's a bit trickier since we're talking about learning theories rather than teaching theories. Please let me know if you have any questions, and as always, I will see you all online.